When We Disagree is a show about arguments, how we have them, why we have them, and their impact on our relationships and ourselves. Everything is arguable. Absolutely everything. Think of something that you think is so self-evidently true that nobody could possibly debate it. And I can guarantee that someone somewhere, maybe on Reddit, maybe in real life, is making that case. The birds aren't real, pseudo-conspiracy is a great example, and there are many, many others. These are arguments over the Mandela effect. Do I really remember Mickey Mouse wearing suspenders? Did that really happen? That's another one. Or think of a time you've been gaslit. Your friend didn't show up at a dinner party that you planned, and when you confront them, the friend says they think they were actually there, or that somehow you were misremembering the whole event. Or think of what philosophers call solipsistic fantasies, but most of us just think of it was all a dream type scenarios. These are matrix types narratives in which nothing is real except the mind. The fact that everything is arguable is a blessing and a curse. That we can contest anything shows how big our world is and how creative many of us are. Widespread agreement can also be boring and predictable, but it has several downsides as well. Bad faith actors easily exploit uncertainty, and without them, if everything is arguable, our beliefs, the comforting truths that we cling to, can be plagued by doubt and second guessing, and we can feel vulnerable in an erratic world. I'm Michael Lee, Professor of Communication and Director of the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston. Our guest today on When We Disagree is Cory Werkheiser. He is the Director of Career Success in the School of Business at the College of Charleston. He is also the host of Busy Work, a podcast about all things business. Cory, tell us an argument story.
Well, I wish I could give you a good argument story. I'm not an arguer by nature. I tend to fight my arguments later in my head. Like I'll go back and think about, I should have said. But I don't like to do that because I find myself not being very good at those situations. But what I do working in the School of Business is very much focused on helping our students get into the workforce successfully as they graduate from the College of Charleston. And I know one thing that is going to come up at some point are situations where they have to argue a position or defend a position or advocate for themselves where that may get controversial or adversarial. And I don't know that they're always prepared for that. Saw an article a week or two ago. It was New York Times. The executive editor was talking about journalism in general and how different journalism is from when he had started 40 years ago or so. And one of the things he mentioned was he feels like it's difficult for generational today to be comfortable with dissenting views. And I feel like my entire working career, and I've been in education for a long time. I was a teacher for 12 years in high school, which saw a lot of situations that were probably confrontational and difficult, that I was helping to diffuse. But I think, one of the problems that I run into with students is they're not aware that that's going to be a situation. They think they're going to go, they're going to start a job, job's going to be fine, they're going to be good, it's going to be 40 years, they're going to retire, when every day they're going to be fighting a battle to some point. So helping students understand this healthy discussion, being able to be prepared to defend themselves and advocate for themselves, but also doing that in a positive way so there isn't damage to the corporate culture when they're working on those things. I know you've recently done some kind of a presentation on that too, right?
I do some trainings along these lines, and I've spoke to business leaders about contentiousness in the workforce. Let's start with like a couple questions that I'm struck by your story. The first one is, let's start with biography. You mentioned that you're not contentious by nature and then, quote, not really good at those situations.
Yeah.
Talk that through a little bit if you don't mind.
I'm one of these people when the anger starts to rise, it goes right to my face. Okay. So it's very obvious. I think I know. I've got good affect tolerance. When somebody is telling me a difficult situation, I can handle that. I don't have an over-aggressive response or even like if it's a serious situation, I'm not going to be, oh no, that's terrible. How did you? I have very good affect tolerance on those things. But if it's something I feel passionately about that may be causing the blood to rise, I feel like it goes right to my face. And I don't do well in that. I may say something that's not well articulated or effective. And so I tend to avoid doing that just because I don't want to say something that's going to be that I'm going to regret later. I'm one of these people that believes that not saying anything is lots of times the better course of action. because if you can't articulate it well, then you end up creating a situation that's difficult. I think part of that stems from being a teacher, being in the classroom. You have 35 students and they all have an opinion about something, and you have to moderate that and contain that and guide that. I was always proud of the fact that when elections came around, my students never knew where I was going to vote, because I was happy to argue points that weren't necessarily what I believed, simply to get the student to have to defend what they believe.
Yeah.
And I never would say, hey, here's why I stand on an issue, or here's how I feel about it.
Sure.
Because I didn't want them to know. I wanted them to be able to defend it themselves, what they were saying.
And there's very educational value there in kind of switch side debates,
Yes.
and encouraging people to adopt positions they don't necessarily agree with or see the world through one another's eyes. But it is also, as somebody who's done this in the classroom, a way to avoid having any of my own skin in the game, because I don't have to get into the fray.
Yeah.
I don't have to get my blood boiling. I don't
Sure.
have to defend anything that I personally believe, because I am Mr. Objective
Right.
in my ivory tower, and just
Right.
letting other people do the stress tolerance building of debate while I stay above the fray.
Well, for me, it was always dealing with 16, 17-year-olds who are so impressionable. I didn't want to be the cause of an opinion. I didn't want to be in a situation where something I said led them to be like, oh, yeah, well, I guess I should believe that because that's what Mr. Work thinks.
Sure.
It was more important to me to be like, look, there are always two sides of an issue. You may not agree with both sides, but there always will be different sides of an issue.
As an aside, Mr. Work is a hell of a nickname.
Yeah, I kind of regret that when I got here, everybody started calling me Cory, and that stuck, because I really prefer that.
I would as well. And so to transition from your past teaching career to your current collegiate, both teaching and advisor role.
Yes.
So part of your role then, dealing with this contentious corporate culture, as the New York Times had mentioned and many others have remarked about, is to prepare students for a contentious culture in the workplace, because perhaps they'll graduate business school being excellent accountants, but lacking in both perspective and communication skills to argue for their position or to manage objections to their position. Is that right?
Yeah, and depending on where you end up, there's always going to be arguments about something. And we tend to always think about religion or personal or political, and those are obvious. But there can be arguments about how are we going to spend the budget this year, or hey, we've got a reduction in force coming up. We're going to riff some employees. Who are we going to riff? And there's a very contentious situation there of, I may really like this person and not want them to get laid off, but you may think otherwise. And now we've got to argue about that. And the significance of that is we're arguing about somebody else's livelihood, in that sense. So being prepared to be effective and forceful without being aggressive, and being able to negotiate to a point is very important. And I think a skill that maybe not every student is aware they're going to need almost daily when they get into the workforce.
I'm curious about how you do this. In other words, I'm a student, the audience is a student. What are the nuts and bolts by which you teach somebody to prepare for a contest of ideas, to advocate for their own positions respectfully, and to listen and give credence to another side, even if they're feeling an immediate knee-jerk negative reaction to hearing contrary views?
Well, I'm fortunate in that we work with a lot of business people in the School of Business. I get a lot of good stories, and especially in my class, which is a career development class, it's story time almost every class. Hey, I was talking to so-and-so last week. They mentioned this situation that came up. Let's talk about that. Let's discuss what happened there, what were maybe some better solutions that could have come along. I think that's important. And then in my individual advising with students, as they come into my office, I've got this internship. I'm going to be there this summer. All right, let's talk about what that's going to entail. What are you going to need to do? Here are some situations that may come up based on previous interns that I've spoken with. You may not be expecting that there will be a situation where you have to negotiate, but you may be in a situation where you have to negotiate with a new client, potential client. Certainly what I run into a lot this season with the May graduates is negotiation of that initial salary offer. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of students just expect that here's the number, I'm going to take it. I'm just so excited I got this number, without thinking that there needs to be some back and forth. And I even tell my students, like, I think you're a business student. If I'm hiring you for my company, I'm going to be a little disappointed if you don't try to negotiate a little bit at least, so that you can prove to me that you're prepared for the business world. And it's important to be able to explain, here's how that works, here's what that looks like, and then kind of advise and guide through that process, because it's very scary when you're 20 something years old and you're afraid if I throw a counter offer, they're going to revoke the offer entirely.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not how that happens if it's a reasonable counter offer anyway.
I'm struck by kind of an interesting irony here, which is that you spend, at least as a person, as a human interacting with the world, you mentioned not wanting to engage
Yes.
in conflict, debate, maybe some suppression, maybe some avoidance, and then being in a position not only just to assess contentiousness, debate, argument, antagonism in
Yep.
the workforce, but then to prepare students to deal with the very thing that you don't want to do as a human.
I think part of that goes back to teaching. I'm comfortable helping other people with those things.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoy that. It's just personally because I do have strong opinions about things, and I find myself in a situation where I'm in more of an advisory role.
Yeah.
I don't feel comfortable saying those things if it's going to come across. I don't ever want to come across as saying, because I'm in this role, this is what I think, and therefore that's correct. I don't ever want that to be the situation.
So much of dealing with conflict is knowing what to say, of course.
Yeah.
It is knowing your relative power position versus the other person's, kind of the range of possibilities in the moment, and maybe preparing for that ahead of time. Part of it is knowing how to listen and not have the kind of knee-jerk reaction, but actually hear the other person so you can make sure that you're understanding their position and responding to the case as they make it, not the case as you imagine it in your mind.
Right.
Or a similar case that somebody else has made that they've kind of heard somebody else say before, right? But fundamentally, on an internal level, so much of it is about just stress tolerance, just being comfortable in the moment,
Mm-hmm.
in a contest of ideas. And some of that can be taught, and some of that must be experienced, almost like exposure therapy
Sure.
in a way.
Yeah.
So how do you then, whether it's for yourself or students or both, increase that stress tolerance?
Part of it is I think it's just practice. It's especially when we're starting a new role, and it's difficult for a soon-to-be graduate or right out of school, because for really 16 years of your life, K-12 and then 4 years of college, there's not much decision making. We like to tell students they're picking classes. They're really not. They're following a degree path. We like to tell students they're making a lot of decisions about things. They're really not. There's a lot of things that are set up. Housing situations are mostly not big decisions. Budget situations when you're a student are usually limited. You're not making major decisions about those things. And then all of a sudden you graduate and you're doing all of those things full time yourself. I think it's probably the biggest shock for a recent graduate is trying to figure out how to negotiate all of that, navigate all of that, on top of learning a new job and learning all of those things. But over time, you start to develop those skills because you've had that experience, you've learned those things, and sometimes you've learned them the hard way, and that helps you to build that tolerance. I look back on my own ability to discuss something. I do better if in the moment I don't respond, and later on I think about it. I'm very good at that follow-up email, mm-hmm. where I can rework it and let Grammarly help me a little bit on what I need to say, and I think maybe even draft and hold it in draft for a couple of days and go back. It's like, nah, that's not what I need to say here. I can reword that better. Uh-huh. And then send that follow-up. So the solution was, I didn't get angry. I didn't explode. I didn't say something I shouldn't. I had time to reflect. That is where I'm better. Working with students, I think it's helpful for me to give them the idea that sometimes you don't have that luxury.
Yeah.
Sometimes you've got to make a decision right away. But lots of times it's just talking about, hey, here's a situation that's come up. This is what another student dealt with and how they handled it, just so you're aware. And so that learning experience back there can help the next student.
One of the things you mentioned at the outset that I wanted to come back to is about generational differences, both mm-hmm. from the perspective of employers hiring younger folks who are entering the workforce, as well as from your own position in coaching, advising, mm-hmm. teaching generations of high school and college students. There's so much discourse now about stress tolerance, to go
Mm-hmm.
back to that phrase, and generational differences potentially in stress tolerance, especially as it relates to conflict. There's a lot of chatter from older folks in the workforce that they're not seeing a lot of stress management skills from Gen Z, Gen Alpha.
Sure.
There's also social psychologists who have gotten quite famous, as well as a few sociologists talking about statistical proof for that idea. Do you see that? I don't know. I don't have a dog in this fight, pardon the metaphor, and I'm not an expert on the subject. But I'm curious. You've kind of been on the ground floor of this, teaching generations of students in this very specific
Mm-hmm.
area. What do you think?
I don't disagree with that. I think that there is a level. I always put things in the lens of my parents and my grandparents, and I think about my own growing up in the 70s and the 80s versus my grandparents growing up in the Great Depression and World War II.
Sure.
I think, good grief, I had no stress. I didn't deal with anything. They were thinking about the next meal and, are we going to destroy fascism, and then I'm thinking about my life in the 80s and, what kind of bike am I going to get for Christmas? That was probably the most stressful thing.
There was the specter of nuclear winter.
Yeah, I know. But that was going to be over in a few seconds. I didn't worry about that much. I thought, I'm going to have 15 minutes to be concerned about that. And then it's all going to be gone. I'm going to be carbonized. I think the biggest thing is when you look at generations and how they grow up, my parents were very much figure these things out, but they were always there for guardrails.
Mm-hmm.
I do feel like, I worked with high school students. I had very limited interactions with parents. It was very unusual for me to hear from a parent. And when I came into higher education, I thought, well, I'm never going to hear from parents. I hear from parents. I get phone calls about questions about scholarships, advising, questions about job searching and things. And I always feel like this should be a question that should be coming from the student, that I should be dealing with the student. And of course, I'm severely limited in what I can say anyway by FERPA regulation. So usually my knee-jerk answer to that is, it's a very good question. Why don't you have your son or daughter reach out to me, and I'd be glad to help them?
That's a good answer.
9 times out of 10, that's what happens.
Yeah.
But I do feel like sometimes there is way more parental involvement, even into 20s, that I didn't have. My parents, by the time I got to college, my parents were like, you're going to have to figure it out. Oh, you screwed that up? Well, that's your figure it out. You're going to have to fix that. And that was a great learning experience for me. And I did stupid stuff and learned learned good skills from those mistakes. But I do anecdotally, maybe, although you're saying there may be more data than I realize, anecdotally, I feel like students are being given way more protection, way more coverage later in life than I would have seen in my generation. Definitely, certainly in my parents' and grandparents' generation. So I don't think that's an illusion. I think that's true. The problem is, I feel like when you don't have a chance to develop those skills in dealing with stressful situations when you're younger, it gets really hard to do that as you start to age.
The last question is kind of a doozy. It seems like there are at least 3 ways to talk about conflict in the workforce, and then to, as you say, prepare students or to prepare anybody working in this environment for that conflict. 1, conflict is bad and should be avoided or suppressed or worked around as safely as possible.
Mm-hmm.
2, conflict is inevitable, and like traffic, it's just something you're going to have to deal with. So prepare yourself for that outcome. And 3, conflict is good. Conflict helps us make decisions. Conflict clarifies the truth of the situation. Conflict gets all of the potential options into the room so that we can make the best possible decision. Which of those do you opt for the most when you talk to students or employers about conflict in the workplace?
Well, I don't think traffic is a good word to use because I get pretty angry in traffic most of the time. For me, it's, I've learned, I know myself. I know how I deal with situations that are difficult. I have worked with people that were unflappable. They could have somebody screaming at them and it doesn't bother them. They're fine with that. I've learned from my own experience that I do better when I have time to reflect. I'm not good in the moment. I'm not a good arguer in the moment for sure. I do better when I have a chance to reflect. I feel like probably it's one of these things where over time you have to develop that system that works best for you. for me, it's probably been situations where I said the wrong thing, did the wrong thing, and learned, okay, the fallback on that was then I had to do damage control and I had to apologize. And I'm happy to do that. I've never had a problem admitting when I was wrong. I just don't like to have to do that. I would rather not create a situation where I have to give an apology. So, for a lot of people, my advice would be, particularly in students I'm working with right now, is you're going to have to figure out what works best for you and learn how to use that process within what you deal with day to day. And if you can do that, you're going to be fine. But if you know, like I know, that I am not good in that immediate moment, then don't lash out in that immediate moment, because it's never going to turn out well. Learn how to maybe the word is internalize. I don't know. I don't feel like I hold on to grudges. I can't. We even tried to think about an argument here at the beginning. I was like, I can't recall one. I'm sure I've been in them before. It's just not something that I hold on to. But being prepared to know, this is where I'm good. This is how I work well. This is how I can handle these situations. And then finding ways to make sure you're in the situation that you can handle it effectively. It's a learning experience. It's taken me years to figure that out.
Mr. Work, thank you so much for being on When We Disagree.
Hey, thank you.
When We Disagree is recorded at the College of Charleston with creator and host Michael Lee. Recording and sound engineering by Jesse Kunz and Lance Laidlaw. Reach out to us at whenwedisagree@gmail.com.